Okay, so hello again, this time from a slightly different angle and a different role. Let me get right into it. So as you can see already from the title or subtitle of the talk, the emphasis of our talk will be on the phenomenon of vital normativity, and in general we will try to pursue two main goals. So the first one will be we will try to outline the idea of vital normativity as it was presented by Georges Canguilhem, and in this regard we will be referring to, our talk will be somewhat similar to some of the things that Timothée said, but with different aspects. And also we will be outlining some of the problems that remain in this particular account. Namely, Canguilhem managed to really demonstrate the importance or significance of vital norms within the context of biomedical sciences. However, he never, or at least not in his earlier works, he didn't really flesh out the idea of what he means by vital normativity, which then can lead to many different problems. So in the second step, we will try to do this to a certain degree. So we will try to provide some sort of a philosophical thematization, philosophical substantiation of this idea of vital normativity, and we will be doing it from two hopefully synchronous and coalescing perspectives from Merleau-Ponty and Varela. Now this is more or less still a work in the making, so to speak. We've just barely started doing this, so you are literally present at the birth of something, so bear this in mind, yeah, so that we're trying to weave very different threads together, so it might show occasionally. But the crucial thing that we would like to do is we would like to try to do this thematization through the notion of institution and through the notion of problematic and interrogation. And we'll try to elucidate what we mean by these two notions. This is a very brief itinerary. As said at the beginning, we will use Canguilhem's conception of vital norms, vital normativity as a thematic outline. And we will point out three aspects of normativity that will be especially important. Then we will move on to Maurice Merleau-Ponty, where we will try to do some philosophical fleshing out through the notions of body schema, institution, and interrogation. And finally, I will try to apply some of these ideas to Varela's work and attempt a slightly different reading of some of the well-known concepts like autonomy, operational closure, sense-making, and this might perhaps lead to a somewhat heterodox reading of Varela's ideas. So to start with the first part, Canguilhem famously says that life is normative, and of course the question immediately is raised, what does this mean? We will focus on three interrelated aspects of vital normativity here: polarity, institution, and transcendence. Polarity means the following of the norms, institution means establishing of the norms, and transcendence means going beyond the norms. These are not three separate aspects, they are all interrelated in Canguilhem's work, and they are very interesting because they shed a somewhat different light on the same phenomenon. So let's start with polarity. Canguilhem says that life is not a reality identical to itself. So it's not identical which coincides with itself. In other words, that's his way of saying that it is not a thing or an object. What is it then? He says that that life is polarity, dynamic polarity, and he in this regard speaks of biological polarity. Now, what does polarity mean? When Canguilhem uses this term, he means it. He uses it in a way that means that life is not indifferent to the conditions in which it is possible, that it is far removed from an indifference to the conditions which are made for it. Or in sum, there is no biological indifference. So shortly, we could say that life is basically, or this idea of polarity means non-indifference. If indifference means neutrality, having a neutral quality, life is precisely the opposite. It is non-neutral. And this means differentiation, or in other words, preference and exclusion. So In this regard, Canguilhem speaks about propulsion and repulsion. So propulsion is a movement towards that which is preferred, repulsion, movement away from that which is not preferred. And he says, for example, even for an amoeba, living means preference and exclusion. And for example, every organic function does not work indifferently in several directions. A need places the proposed objects of satisfaction in relation to propulsion and repulsion. And Canguilhem contrasts, so tries to flesh out this idea a little bit further when he says that physical processes, physical-chemical processes unfold according to law, whereas vital activity follows the norm. And he gives the example, for example, of the wastes of digestion, which are not properly processed anymore. So when this happens, and this can lead then to the poisoning or digestion, or for example, congestion, the physical-chemical laws are still in place. So nothing has changed. Still, the physical-chemical processes follow these physical laws. However, something clearly has changed on the biological level. There has been a divergence of some sort happening. And of course, then the question is raised, what does this mean to follow the norm? What is a norm? Now, norm originally stems from Latin word norma, which meant the carpenter's or T-square. So it's basically the square that you use to measure the right angles. And in this regard, it designates a standard or a norm. So life, in this regard, we might say, is basically that which follows certain standards, which follows certain norms. So that which gravitates towards the preferred, that which gravitates towards that which is valuable, towards states that are of a value to it. And value, interestingly, etymologically, also means to be in good health. So that's why life gravitates towards health in the sense of that which is preferred. So one thing that we see here is that a norm is an achievement or realization. It is not something that is guaranteed, so there is something precarious about norms, unlike laws, and it allows for infractions or for failures. And furthermore, this is very interesting, Canguilhem says norms in this regard are not existent or given. They are not a given or an existent in the sense of they cannot be found on the level of facts. So why? Because he says norms are that which allow for the correction of a given, of a fact. It is that which allows for a modification in a certain direction, in a direction of value, so to speak. And finally, with regards to polarity, it is important to emphasize that norms are not intra-organismal. Okay? They are not internal to the organism, but are always relational, according to Canguilhem, which means that basically they refer to the organism being able to find an environment, a milieu, which is conducive to its pursuing the preferred state, so to speak. Pretty trivial for many people who are familiar with enactivism and so on and so forth, but it will be important. Okay, so that's the first segment. This is the polarity segment. Now the second one is institution. Life, according to Canguilhem, is more than just polarity and norm following. It is also what Canguilhem calls a normative activity. He speaks of biological normativity or vital normativity or the original normative character of life. Now, what does normativity in this regard mean? Usually in philosophy, says Canguilhem, when we talk about normativity, we think of evaluation or qualification of a certain fact according to a certain norm, according to a certain standard. However, he says this is a secondary understanding of normativity, which already presupposes a more fundamental understanding of normativity, which is that which establishes norm. So the first account already presupposes there is a model that you should follow. The second one means the birthing of the model, so to speak, the origin of the model. And this, he says, is the place of vital or organic normativity, which is primary. Okay, so life then not only follows, but also establishes, posits, institutes norms, or as Timothy said, so this is the creative aspect of normativity. He says that life is unconscious position of value. The healthy state allows transition to new norms. And we can understand this if we contrast two kinds of original modes of life, according to Canguilhem. So two ways of being, of a living being, which are health and disease. And this, again, is very closely related to what Timothy was saying with regards to conservative and creative norms. So, when it comes to health and disease, according to Canguilhem, both follow norms, because as long as a certain structure, as long as a certain form is alive, it will be a polarized activity. It will be polarity, which means that it will always follow norms. However, there is a difference. In health, this attitude is propulsive, and in disease, it is repulsive. Strange words, okay, what does he mean by that? Propulsive means that there is a certain fecundity in life, and this means that there is a capacity to establish new norms, to institute new norms, whereas in disease, this repulsivity is related to the rigidity, so to holding on of the norms. Again, if I relate this to what Timothy said, it is like a very, very rigid conception, or rigid not conception necessarily, but a rigid mode of being a self that tries to preserve itself under all conditions. Okay, so health then, so normality in a stricter sense, is not related just to one milieu, but to different milieus. As I said, norms for Canguilhem are always relational. And with regards to this aspect, the capacity to establish new norms, this would mean that healthy organisms are capable to adjust not only to a milieu, this according to Canguilhem, following Goldstein, is characteristic of pathological organisms. They are also able to adjust to new milieus and to the fluctuations within the milieus. Okay, and then the final aspect is the capacity to transcend, or transcendence. So, living beings, or life, has the capacity to self-transcend, to go beyond its current institutions or actualizations. Canguilhem here refers favorably to words of Minkowski, who says that life is a dynamic force of transcendence. And he says that what is characteristic for life in its, let's say, original givenness is precisely this capacity of a very strong openness and transcendence. He talks about the initial indeterminacy of the capacity to institute new norms. And what is very interesting with this regard is that the way Canguilhem uses the term life seems to put life in a certain sense outside of the organisms. Not completely, and it is not clear how exactly, but as if in a certain sense, life is a normative activity passing through living beings. And let me give you just two examples, and this is so small, it's just... Life, says Canguilhem, as not only subject to the environment, but also as an institution of its own environment, thereby posits values not only in environment, but also in the organism itself. Another example, life, using the variations of living forms, obtains a kind of insurance against excessive specialization. So there seems to be a certain moment of life which in a certain sense, and interestingly, goes beyond the living form, as if living form is always like self-transcending in some manner. Now, as said at the very beginning, these are the three aspects: polarity, institution, transcendence, or following norms, establishing norms, and going beyond norms. And these can all also potentially lead to three problematic interpretations. So, as you see, the positing of the idea of vital normativity challenges a very strictly and narrowly mechanistic account of life. However, it can also lead the interpreter to swing into the opposite extreme. What could be these extremes? With regards, for example, polarity, which means following norms, we might say, if norm is truly non-existent, how are we to understand this? Does it mean that it is some sort of an ideal, some sort of an idealistic imposition? Is it supernatural? With regards to institution, which means that life has the capacity to establish new norms, does this mean that life is inherently constructivist, so that it is able to construct its milieu almost like ex nihilo? And finally, with regards to transcendence, if life is that which can go beyond norms and its current actualizations, what exactly does life mean here? Is it this some sort of a vitalism which requires some sort of a élan vital, some sort of vital principle or entelechie? And here we move on to the second section, Merleau-Ponty, who will hopefully shed some light on some of these questions.
Okay, so as Sebastjan already outlined, I will talk about Merleau-Ponty, and I will talk mostly about the concept of body schema and the notion of institutions. And this is for the purpose of showing how the norm is dynamic, basically. So this should make some connections between norm following and norm instituting or establishing new norms. So this will be the two main sections of my talk, but before that I will briefly show how Merleau-Ponty also himself uses the terminology of norms. So he's using the term norm. And at the end I will finish by presenting some general ideas that Merleau-Ponty formulates. This hopefully will serve as a basis for the last part when Sebastjan comes back and finish with the section on Varela. Okay, so much like Canguilhem, Merleau-Ponty refers to norms in the context of living organisms. This is understandable since both authors draw on very similar resources, in particular Goldstein. In the Phenomenology of Perception, Merleau-Ponty summarizes his interpretation of vital structures from the structure of behavior by writing that the animal itself projects the norms of its milieu and establishes the terms of its vital problem. Merleau-Ponty emphasizes that the projection of norms, thanks to which vital structures realize their equilibrium, is a circular process which is without analogy in the physical world. Unlike physical structures, vital structures are not merely the function of their inner and outer material conditions, but also reciprocally impose the terms of their self-preservation, or in other words, it is the organism itself that measures the action of things upon it and itself delimits its milieu. However, Merleau-Ponty elaborates on vital normativity even in contexts where he does not explicitly use the notion of norm. One such context is related to the concept of the body schema, which he adapted from neurology. As mentioned already by Sebastjan, originally the term norm referred to the carpenter's tool for measuring objects and their properties. Merleau-Ponty interestingly uses the notion in exactly this sense. That means the notion of body schema. For him, the body schema is the standard of measure, étalon, for our interaction with the environment. In the neurology, the concept was primarily related to the measurement of our postures and movements, but Merleau-Ponty significantly broadens the meaning of the concept. For him, it also incorporates Husserl's phenomenological insights, such as the body serving as the 0 point of orientation in space, and defining the optimal mode of givenness for various objects, such as particular distance for visual objects. In general, Merleau-Ponty understands the body schema as an intuitive and implicit awareness of our own body that helps us to measure the relevance of the environment for our actions. For example, we implicitly and intuitively measure the steepness of a staircase or distance in space with our body's fitness. So for a senior or an injured person, practical destinations may become too far all of a sudden, even if the objective distances remain the same. Or another example, when our eyes are strained, the text we are reading becomes too difficult all of a sudden, and so on. Similarly, Merleau-Ponty argues that the phantom limb, often experienced by amputees, should be interpreted as a disruption of the body schema. Having a phantom limb and experiencing phantom pain means living according to an obsolete vital norm. The physical part of the body needed to support the patient's usual norm is no longer available. And conversely, the phantom disappears when the amputee accepts their loss and finds a new norm of living without the corresponding part of their past identity. The notion of body schema defined in this way is consistent with what we could call constructivist or projective interpretation. In this view, the norm is situated within the organism and projected outward. However, Merleau-Ponty's most interesting argument goes beyond this. In his works Beyond the Phenomenology of Perception, he demonstrates that the body schema as a standard of measure is dynamic adjusting based on environmental factors, and relational, situated between the organism and the environment, not solely within it. For example, Merleau-Ponty writes that the body schema is not merely projective, but also introjective. The body does not just unilaterally dictate the vital value of perceived objects, but it also accommodates to them. The body opens the field for something to be perceived, and the world specifies that relationship. Or as Merleau-Ponty writes, a perceived figure indicates what is required from our body in terms of movement, posture, and attitude, and the body completes the given by appropriately adapting itself to it. Perception therefore follows what Merleau-Ponty calls an interrogative logic. Through its initial postures and movements, the body asks relatively general questions, we could say. The perceptual figures provide relatively specific answers, and this leads to the readjustment of the questions and so on. Merleau-Ponty also notes that the unity of the body schema is closely related to our actions. Inactivity leads to destructuring of the body schema, such as in the apraxia induced by sleep. Similarly, certain experimental postures disrupt body schema, such as postures involved in the hand reversal illusion. This comes like this, so then trying to move your fingers. When you have, it's very difficult and you will be slow. In contrast, increased mobility, as seen in compensatory movements in some patients, like Gelb and Goldstein's patient Schneider, improves the structuration of the body schema. Several other factors illustrate the dynamic nature of the body schema. Without going into detail, I note that the body schema is temporally relative because it depends on both short-term and long-term events preceding our current posture. So this can be shown by reference to so-called Kohn-Stamms phenomenon. For example, when you are walking for some time with a heavy backpack and then you take it off, you feel like you are about to fly. You feel like this, so you have the feeling of lightness. So this shows that the normal tonus is shifted and it has it's different than from when you are walking without any heavy object on your back. The body schema depends on exteroceptive situation rather than solely on internal physiological mechanisms. The example Merleau-Ponty gives relates to the fact that when there is a person with damage to their inner ear, the labyrinth, for example, because of a stroke, this may provoke a displacement of their vertical axis, so they are walking sideways. But this can be compensated by visual anchoring, right? So the vertical axis is not solely dependent on what's going on in the inner ear. So, as expected from Merleau-Ponty, his work on the body schema confirms that a living body does not overlap with a physical or physiological body. The body schema does not correspond to any material property of the body. It is relational, and in this sense, it is non-existent. Second, more importantly, Merleau-Ponty's work shows that the norm of bodily interaction with the environment is not merely projective, but also interjective, linked to environmental changes and open to permanent negotiation with the environment. And the third point, the normative value is never fully predetermined for Merleau-Ponty. The environment plays a crucial role in the interrogative dynamics by specifying the underdetermined norm projected by the organism. Here I would like to transition to the other concept that is important for us, and that's the concept of institution. It's very interesting to see that the interrogative logic of perception described through the body schema is also identified by Merleau-Ponty at a deeper level because it underlies the being of living organisms, not just the perception of their environment. So Merleau-Ponty refers to he explores this idea through the notion of institution, which he took from Husserl, and this will serve as a guiding concept for me in this part. So in Husserl, the institution refers to a foundational moment in the history of human culture when a spatial-temporal domain of sense or a field of problems becomes opened. So for example, geometry is an institution founded by Euclid. And Merleau-Ponty writes about the institution the following, quote, Husserl used the fine word of Stiftung, foundation or establishment, to designate first of all the indefinite fecundity of each moment of time, the workings of culture which open a tradition, which continue to have value after their historical appearance and which require beyond themselves other operations. This is a quote from Prose of the World by Merleau-Ponty. However, Merleau-Ponty makes several important modifications. First, for Husserl, the institution is founded through an act of a subject. For Merleau-Ponty, the foundational moment corresponds to an event, which may as well occur without the active contribution of a subject. Second, in Husserl's view, the instituted field is teleologically oriented toward fulfilling its sense. For Merleau-Ponty, the field is subject to an open-ended interrogation. It is something to continue, an invitation to a sequel, rather than a determination of a certain future. And third, the logic of institution is not limited merely to the field of human experience and culture, but it is also found in biological processes. This leads Merleau-Ponty to evoke animal institution and institution as it relates to life generally. Merleau-Ponty is interested in the notion of institution because he wants to overcome a major limitation of the philosophy of consciousness, namely the fact that there is nothing in the objects capable of throwing the constituting consciousness back toward other perspectives. To use our terminology, he seeks to move beyond the projectivist or constructivist interpretation of human experience. In relation to life, the overcoming of a constructivist interpretation is linked to his rejection of vitalism. To paraphrase the argument just cited, for Merleau-Ponty, life possesses inherent unity, but this unity cannot be interpreted in vitalistic terms because life is thrown back toward other perspective by objects it encounters. The logic of institution in life can be seen in Merleau-Ponty's interpretations of embryological studies, in which he draws from authors such as Canguilhem, Gesell, Spemann, or Driesch. But I will focus on a simpler example, which is that of a simple example of animal institution, which is the example of imprinting in birds, specifically precocial birds like ducks. So during a critical period at the beginning of such bird's life, the encounter with a certain object imprints its structural characteristics onto the animal instinctual behavior. The bird then recognizes the imprinted object as its parents, so we can see ducks following their mothers on the pond. For Merleau-Ponty, this suggests that innate instinctual trigger schema is initially lacunary and requires structuration, which sensitizes them to a more specific form of stimuli. Here, the instinct is seen as a systematic elaboration of the world rather than a reference to a pre-constituted world. This elaboration transforms and specifies the range of objects with the value parent for the animal. Moreover, the filial imprinting represents institution also in a temporal sense. It has a prospective value because it affects the adult sexual behavior of the animal, and conversely, the choice of mating partner during the adult life of the animal is retrospectively oriented because it is, in a sense, a recommencement of the choice made earlier during the filial imprinting. So Merleau-Ponty draws some general conclusions from these phenomena, which can be summarized in 3 points. While he recognizes that the plasticity of vital normativity is constrained by factors like species, developmental stage, specific body aspects, the biological examples he discusses demonstrate for him that what represents a meaningful stimulus for the organism can in principle be substituted. In other words, from an ontogenetic perspective, the norm regulating the interaction between the organism and its environment is systematic but always provisional. The second point, there is always a gap between the normative values initially available to the animal and the values concretely realized in the development or in the interaction with the environment. For example, imprinting cannot be seen as an inherently beneficial evolutionary mechanism, since it can lead to fatal mistakes, such as a bird imprinting on a human caretaker instead of its natural parent. And the third point, there is a link between the underdetermined nature of the vital norm and the dynamism of the organism. Because the vital norm is a dimension of sense that calls for reorganizations and specifications, the organism is propelled beyond its current state. The vital norm corresponds to a virtual axis oscillating between lack and excess, anticipation and retrospection. To summarize, I would like to highlight three insights from Merleau-Ponty's interpretation of life, and again in 3 points. So for Merleau-Ponty, life exhibits what we have called interrogative logic. The organism's earlier stages set the foundation for its future, but a concrete future is required to provide still provisional resolutions to earlier imbalances. In this sense, life does not just maintain spatio-temporal coherence, but anticipates the relevance of facts that do not yet exist and retrospectively integrates facts encountered prematurely. Second, there is a permanent gap in life. The gap between the open field of problems and the resolutions negotiated with the environment is never closed. As Merleau-Ponty writes, life entails a factor of disorder, a rupture of equilibrium that must be continuously counteracted within concrete historical situations not foreseen by nature. These are all quotes from the course on nature by Merleau-Ponty. And third, consequently, life is characterized by a specific sense of problematicity. As Merleau-Ponty puts it, as interrogative, life is not merely an implicit definition of privileged norms, but the attempted establishment of something more, a first emergence of the problematic. In this way, Merleau-Ponty's interpretation of life opened a way to interpret also the motive of transcendence found in Canguilhem and beyond. For Merleau-Ponty, the transcendence is related to the initial imbalance of the organism. The more, as he claims that the more premature the species or more imbalanced, the deeper the gap that permeates it, which makes the instituting events more significant. So Merleau-Ponty argues that in humans, the transition between the stages is never perfect, so much so that the formative events in some cases become symbolic metrics and become a frame of reference that then opens room for an indefinite elaboration, which doesn't seem to happen in the case such as imprinting in birds. And to close my section, I would like to point out that, of course, these ideas from Merleau-Ponty, they have also their own limitations, and what we have been talking about with regard to Merleau-Ponty is taken from his lectures. It's not that clearly formulated, and as it is known, he passed quite unexpectedly, so there is some there's a huge volume of working notes that has been used by commentators, and these notes are fragmentary, not systematic. So this idea, his ideas about life are not clear. They don't constitute a final system. So this is where we believe that we could elaborate on Merleau-Ponty's ideas by connecting them with some other approaches or more recent approaches from biology and beyond. And hopefully this could be done by connecting Merleau-Ponty with Varela. So here is where Sebastjan comes with his intervention.
Okay, the last section. This will be put in a slightly different register, so apologies for that. It will be especially useful for those who are familiar already with Varela. But the key idea is basically to use some of these, let's say, conceptual catalysts that one finds in Merleau-Ponty institutions, in interrogation, gap, and similar things, and see if they can be somewhat fleshed out by Varela, and at the same time using them to add a slightly different perspective, different angle on Varela. So, like I said, potentially heretical reading, not necessarily, but potentially. Okay, so the key thing that I will be doing here is I will be, in a certain sense, cashing on the difference that Jan mentioned, so that there's a gap between the physiological or physical and the living body, and I will be using a similar gap or a similar mismatch between organization, which is usually defined as the necessary relations which define the system in Varela, and structure, which usually is characterized as the actual relations between the components which integrate the system as such. It is a very important distinction, one that carries a lot of epistemic weight and often somewhat poorly thematized. So, let us start. According to Varela, living beings are characterized by a special type of organization, and this is autonomous organization. Now, immediately there's a danger here, because the term autonomy has a very equivocal meaning and has also very strong Kantian flavor. Literally, it means self-law, and very often then it could be seen as organism as a self-governing and self-legislating agent prescribing laws for itself, which in a certain sense it's true, but it can also be problematic, so equivocal in its meaning. What are the two potential problems? The first issue is, forgot this. So if law is a self-law, it is clearly cannot be understood as a physical law, as we were talking about the physical laws in the Canguilhemian setting. Clearly, it allows for infractions. Autonomous organization can fail to be achieved. It is susceptible to breakdowns, disruptions. It is less a law than an orientation or tendency towards that which is preferred. That is to say, that towards which is valuable. Or, in other words, it is more similar to norm than to a law. And furthermore, if law is understood as a self-law, the nature of the law, even though we might be using the same term, changes. The law cannot be pre-given. It is not something that is already constituted and then simply followed. Rather, it has to first be achieved or established. The organism does not impose a predefined rule to itself, like, for example, in Kant, the transcendental subject imposes categories on the world, so to speak, but establishes it through itself, so through its way of being, through how and what it is. And in this regard, it is more dynamic, more processual, and open-ended, the idea of autonomy and self-law, ergo closer to normativity than fixed norm. And I would like to now spell out what this would mean if we take autonomy, understood in this particular sense, as some sort of one way to thematize normativity in Canguilhem. So autonomy, as you know, is characterized by operational closure, and the simplest example is autopoiesis, which is basically designates the circularity between self-reproducing metabolic network and self as a bounded delineated whole. And there's a certain problem with this very famous picture, and we can get back to it, and it will be indirectly exposed in my talk. Operational closure, more generally, basically means circular, recursive, or self-referential activity in which a network of operations operates, that is to say, feeds back on itself, and in and through this operation institutes a system that enables this activity to unfold in a coherent, concerted manner. So basically, just one of the possible characterizations of operational closure, which probably all of you know. However, what is most crucial for our case is that because operational closure is a circular activity, because it is a movement and it is recursive, self-referential, life, which is characterized by operational closure, can never rest, it can never stop, because rest means to die, and it can only relate to itself, but it can never coincide or coalesce with itself. Thus, we might say that at every moment, life is already beyond and behind itself. It is beyond or ahead of its current or temporary actualization, but it is behind its anticipated wholeness, behind its completion or fulfillment. This is precisely where this mismatch that I was talking about enters. Namely, living beings, with regards to what I've just said, could be characterized by a mismatched gap, or we might even say productive tension between structure, its current actualization, and organization, the self-referential system as an operationally closed whole. Structure in this sense, is always one step behind the organization, or the opposite. Organization is always one step ahead of the structure. In my opinion, Varela overlooks this important temporal, processual aspect, conceiving of the relationship between the structure and organization in an overtly atemporal, even spatial manner, and of organization, form, and so on in a too reified, objective way, as in, to use a Canguilhem's terminology, existent, a given, but it is precisely not, and it cannot be, an existent and given, because an existent and given would be self-identical, it rests in itself, coincides with itself, and for Varela this is precisely closedness or end of circularity, death. And what I mean by this specific reified account is precisely the fact that you can depict it as you do when you talk about autopoiesis, and again we can get back to this specific example later on. So from this perspective, an organism is not a self-centered whole, but a wholeness delayed, we might say, a wholeness postponed. It is a dynamic form whose completion or fulfillment is always in a not yet. Structurally, its wholeness is, or its fulfillment is always beyond it, and organizationally, its actualization is always behind it. Or if we phrase this in more Merleau-Pontian terms, apologies, its structure is marked by a perpetual lack. It is marked by that which is missing to reach the anticipated fulfillment, and therefore requires ongoing change to overcome it. Reversely, its organization is marked by an excess of being, what it could or should be, and therefore again requires ongoing change to attain it. The gap or mismatch between them can only be temporarily bridged by an ongoing yet circumscribed change and activity. And precisely because this requirement for circumscribed change and activity, organizational closure, as is also pointed out by Varela, corresponds with structural openness. And by structural openness, I here mean what Varela means when he talks about a dynamic coupling between structure of the organism and that of its environment. And these two mutually enable one another. They co-specify each other. So structural coupling actualizes and specifies operational closure. Operational closure delimits and circumscribes the structural coupling. So because of this structural coupling, living being is in ongoing interaction with its environment. However, this interaction has to be polarized, non-neutral. It has to be an interaction that can help maintain the tension between the structure and organization, or in other words, it has to help enable the stable ways of temporarily overcoming the lack or realizing the excess, as I phrased it in Merleau-Pontian terms. Now, what is important, and this is different from, for example, what you find in most of Varela's texts, environment is not only the source of perturbations, according to this view. It is also a source of opportunities and innovations, or perhaps more accurately, perturbations are opportunities, breakdowns are possibilities for the readaptation and readjustment. Why? Well, precisely because the wholeness or fulfillment of the organism is not achieved but anticipated, because it is in a certain sense always delayed or postponed, one step ahead, so to speak, the organism has to be able, through ongoing challenges, to creatively modify its current actualization and thus maintain the tension. This polarized interaction usually results in what is usually referred by Varela as the surplus of signification or the surplus of meaning. And it is often related to the sense-making, or sense bestowal even sometimes, which is not a Varelian direct term. However, like autonomy, the term is again ambiguous and is often understood as if the organism is an agent that somehow constructs or projects meaning. But from our alternative, this different perspective, which seems to be more in line with at least late Varela's intentions, it would be more correct to say that meaning emerges not because the organism is an agent, but because it is engaged in ongoing struggle to become one. Precisely because this delayed wholeness that is characteristic of it. In other words, meaning is what emerges when a temporarily stable way of maintaining the tension between structure and organization has been found. As such, it cannot be seen as the construct or projection of the organism, but rather, since the environment is the source of perturbations as opportunities, as something that can be achieved only through negotiation with the environment, something that we might say engulfs or overfloods both the organism and the environment. So it's closer to the institution or instituting as an activity than the construction or projection. And finally, the sense or meaning on this reading is, we could say, a temporarily stable or coherent manner of maintaining the tension between structure and organization, which is sometimes referred as Umwelt or niche. And it is, we've seen, instituted in a dynamic exchange between the organism and environment. But importantly, this temporary stability is only a modulation of the ongoing circular movement. It is a pause in the recursive dynamism and can thus, in times of crisis fluctuations, be broken through, transcended, reinstituted. Now, the final thing that I would like to mention here is basically that this particular structure, this particular dynamic that we've been describing, and often we use terms that actually have a very metaphorical roots. For example, representation is fundamentally taken from a different discourse into the discourse of science. Well, in this regard here, I think that a way better way of thinking about this dynamic would be one that is related to interrogation or problematicity, as we've called it, in line with Merleau-Ponty. Why? Because there is an interesting dynamic between a question and response. Question, in a certain sense, has a certain delimited characteristic, but at the same time, it is not pre-specified. If it's a genuine question, it is an open field, but it is not a completely open field, so if somebody responds completely out of the field, you will know. However, when somebody gives you the answer, in a certain sense, the question itself changes because you understand what you were questioning, and many things become closed off, and a certain trajectory is opened. So this dynamic between a question and answer would be a very interesting one with regards to this dynamic described here, or as it was previously described in relation to Merleau-Ponty by Jan. So the dynamic between the organizational closure and the structural coupling would be precisely along those lines. So you have a certain delimited field which opens up and then acquires specific specifications, like concrete specifications, which then eventually lead into temporarily stable patterns. And they can go on for a certain time until they basically can go on no further. And then, of course, there's always other possibilities that could be taken, which are not completely open or random. And at the same time, you can also revert to certain possibilities. So you can have breakthroughs, which are not really predictable and which can take you in different routes. Okay. So, very briefly at the end, this is 2 or 3 minutes now. If we come to the, just so that we have some sort of a structure, not because we will really have good answers, but if we come to the initial question, so these problems of supernaturalism, constructivism, and vitalism, what could be said if you take this approach, if you draw your conceptual resources from this particular well of Merleau-Ponty and Varelian caliber? Well, the first thing that we can say, the problem of supernaturalism, the fact that norm does not exist. This in many ways refers to the limitations of the current ontology. Existence understood as an object, basically the limitation to equate existence with object or objecthood, okay? But if you are willing to ontologically think about dynamism, relations, especially observer relations, then of course the whole picture, the whole structure will change. Norm is then non-existent only from the ontologically, let's say, realist perspective, or the perspective which is modeled on the ideal of a thing. It is not a thing, but there are phenomena clearly that are not things, and life being a prime example. And life in this regard should be more appropriately studied as a field phenomenon. It unfolds in time, in concrete local condition, as it negotiates its cohesion, its wholeness. So in this regard, it can be said to be non-existent in an objectivist ontology, but doesn't necessarily have to be seen as non-existent in a different ontology. Finally, the question of constructivism. Sure, organism does actively participate in reshaping the world, but the organism is inside the world, not simply facing it from the outside, some hovering transcendental subject. Worldly events in this regard infract the construction or projection and motivate its readjustment. So institution in this regard is not determining what the value, what the norm will be, but an opening of a question, opening of a problem domain in which the actual value will become specifically situated. And finally, about the question of transcendence or vitalism. Transcending, again, shouldn't be understood as a thing. It could be understood as this interrogative movement, the creative lack of a problem that we've described. So something that always gravitates towards resolutions, but also breaks through them, infringing. Transcendence, in this sense, is related to the underdetermination or rupture of the equilibrium. There is room for positive account of negativity in relation to objective structures, for this creative polarity or creative tension, rather than the need of positing, say, substantive principle, substantive life principle. One can talk about principle, but again, a very ambiguous term. Okay, this would be it. Thank you very much.
Try to avoid reading so far. So yeah, very interesting stuff. I love your definition of life as trying to catch up with yourself constantly. This feels very familiar. I wonder, it's a bit it's a bit vague to me still. I wonder if Rosen's ideas of anticipatory systems would be useful here, which is operating on the idea that the organism has these internal predictive models. So instead of sort of realizing a potential, like the organization that you have here is, the concept is very sort of Aristotelian potential rather than actualized, if I understand it correctly. So if this notion of these internal predictive models are helpful here, because as Rosen himself says, they pull the future into the present by, but they're fallible, like the norms, right? They're open to error and they're constantly adjusted. Modern predictive processing theory is very, it's all in Rosen's Anticipatory Systems book already, 1985, which puts this sort of vague and luminous notion of an organization that is not really here. They're always trying to be that organization, pulls it into the present. Do you have any comments on that? Or on the nature of the organization that you're postulating in general?
Yeah. Okay, so basically what I was trying to do is I was trying to really thematize the philosophical implications of what would it mean to really think the operational closure philosophically, in the sense of, in a certain sense, being a very interesting formal criterion. It is a criterion which is, in a certain sense, precisely, you could call it a positive lack. It has a circularity within it, so it inherently requires specification, but such a specification that can never, in a certain sense, find its resting place, so to speak. So it is a formal criterion which, in a certain sense, always pushes this ongoing movement if it is to be met, and it cannot be met. Now, of course, okay, what does this mean?
So is that like Deacon's intentionality, so aboutness?
In a certain sense, it could be. I don't know enough, but for example, if I go back to what you said, of course, after a while, what you get is you get a stabilizations of specific patterns, which then could lead to these predictive schemas that you described. So what this particular way of thinking would be, on a very let's say meta level, would be to think about the genesis of these types of schemas. So how do you get to schemas which then become temporarily sedimented, and how they can be broken without necessarily being completely contingent, but at the same time having this flexibility. So seeing the schemas as a step in a movement, then starting from schemas and seeing movement from them. So, that would be, for example, temporary solution of this particular tension would be these schemas.
But isn't it that the norms that we're talking about here, also Timothy's talk, I was wondering that.
This would be the norms. This would be the norms.
But they don't specify a specific structure, they specify constraints in which the structure can be realized. But they don't specify any specific structure, right? So the essential properties that are being changed are not really essential, because they can't be changed without killing you. Or in your case, there is no specific organization that you're sort of trying to catch up with, but there's just a bunch of constraints
Precisely.
with which you need to operate. Yeah.
But the thing is also, okay, the issue of constraint, for example, in Canguilhem is very interesting, because precisely because he says that they are related to this interrelationship between the organism and its environment, he will give the examples where you might have constraints which you can, for example, empirically determine or statistically determine, changing given the overall context once the context changes. So the normality or the norm of the same, say, schema that you're interested in can vary depending on this. So this is very interesting.
Yeah.
That for example, and then the question is, of course, to what degree can you talk about constraints? Because always when you talk about constraints, you talk about constraints when you have certain parameters fixed, and then you can measure it, and then you see constraint manifesting itself. Canguilhem will say, yeah, but you're already working, for example, to put this into a different register, you will be working within the domain of the organismal dynamics which allow you to specify this. So you presuppose this in a certain sense, and if it changes, you might have a certain interesting story, but you might not. Life might disregard, let's say, surprise you. And Canguilhem seems to be very, his approach seems to be very strong in the sense of that it is very much unpredictable how this might happen.
Yeah,
So
you may always screw up.
yeah, in a certain sense.
Okay, all right.
But maybe Jan wanted also to add something. I saw that he.
I would just say maybe yes, this would go in the direction you're saying, but at least from the Merleau-Ponty's perspective, there would be a problem with the idea of model and prediction. So what you said is, I would say, objectivist expression of what we are trying to accomplish without the notions of representation or any kind of alternative to it, like model, and prediction, because that's also a sort of representation, at least from Merleau-Ponty would be like that. So we are trying to accomplish something similar, but without some presuppositions which are on the ontological order. And of course, there's a bunch of things around.
Those models don't need to be representational for they just need to be some sort of expectation. But it's very vague.
It's a matter of interpretation.
Yeah, exactly.
What is it?
Okay, I think maybe I'll take a question from board because you have had and then. Yeah.
Thank you, gentlemen. Two small questions. One is that, like me, you have a three-person, you have a trio in your talk, and are you forcing the three of them to make one big concept, or is it meaningful to you that they really have three different contexts, vocabularies, ideologies, project, blah, blah? It's a serious question, you know, at least for me, it's a serious problem or question for my trio. The second question, a little bit more contentful maybe, is, well, there was this really fascinating little phrase that got thrown out about positive lack, and you guys put aside vitalism, or so-called vitalism, easily, but in a sense, your trio, what you do with your trio, is just this narrative of self-actualization, sounds like this narrative of self-actualization. And half the people in the world would call that vitalism. Not in the sense of a dead biological theory from 1920, but in the sense that life grows, emerges, changes, keeps some kind of identity, selfhood, meaning-making, sense-making, etc. And by plenty of reckonings, that's vitalistic. And I'm not saying that to mean, therefore it's great. That's a different part of my personality and not relevant here. I'm just saying, it sounds like just a narrative of self-actualization. And so these things like positive lack, I suspect they're intended to prevent an overly naive vision of self-actualization, but do they do that? How do they do that? I don't know.
first one, well, we are forcing them to one basket. You think we are forcing? Well, we hope we don't force them. You can always emphasize the contrasts, or you can find or look for at least some continuities. That's what we try to do. It's a matter of...
I wasn't reproaching you for forcing them into a straitjacket. I was saying, to what extent is it even meaningful to you, relevant to you, that, like, I don't know, Varela and any of the three seem to have different projects.
Okay, maybe I can add something to this. With Canguilhem and Merleau-Ponty, it's very interesting precisely because they seem to be stemming from a very similar ideational background at some point, and then they for example, both draw heavily on Goldstein, and then they take slightly different routes in the sense of, but still in many ways not completely separate. We might disagree on this one. But I would say that they remain in many ways wedded to a similar project. But Canguilhem is interesting in other questions, and Merleau-Ponty does really try to find thematic tools to flesh out certain ideas that Canguilhem is not particularly interested in fleshing out, because he's interested in other things, and he also maybe is, in a certain sense, reveling in this non-fleshing out. It's also a statement of sorts, okay? So in this regard, I would say that they are very much in line with this, and if one takes on board that Francisco Varela was very heavily influenced by Merleau-Ponty, and he says so explicitly, many of the ideas are, congruent with that. So it would seem that it might be fair. For example, late Varela was very much struggling with his position. He started off in a cybernetics register, which pushed him quite heavily into the constructivist camp. He was never particularly happy there. Already at the beginning of 80s, he starts voicing his disagreement and saying, I'm not a constructivist. And in 90s, he's already frustrated, saying, like, people keep calling me, putting me in radical constructivist. I'm not a radical constructivist, okay? And he's always talking, I'm trying to find the middle path, the middle way, and trying to find the co-specification. But very often, he lacks the let's say, conceptual framework to do so, in a philosophically robust manner. Now this would be one way of approaching it or doing it, by using certain conceptual tools developed by an author he very much admired and whose later work he probably wasn't familiar with. However, the idea of institution, the idea of interrogation, they seem to be very much in line with what he was trying to convey when he was trying to say the bringing forth of meaning, it's neither construction nor is it a representation. Yeah, well, what is it? You need something, right? You need to flesh it out somehow. And interrogation, for example, the problematicity, seems to be a very natural move. And to go to the second question from this directly, I agree with you, and we talked about this problem of vitalism. This is like one of the points that I very much admire in the work you did, and we should have probably qualified it with the substantive vitalism. But the more interesting thing is, it is not so much about vitalism being the bad guys or vitalism being the problems, but there need to be interesting stories, interesting narratives to be said about Elan Vital, about Entelehi. So you can do some work there. And for example, if you see that there is a problem, if you try to understand it in a way that gravitates towards understanding it, say, substantively, then by exploring different possibilities, such as, for example, if there is a positive account of, say, indeterminacy, a positive account of positive negativity or creative negativity. Now, this could be potentially interesting, especially if you can put this then into dialogue with some of the happenings even within science, where you have novel concepts emerging, they're being pressed into the old, let's say, conceptual and theoretical framework, but they don't seem to work really all that well.
I will take one quick question from, I think, Konrad, if you have, or Weber, like...
Well, you can skip my question because it's not...
You will ask it.
You will ask it later.
Yeah.
Then Weber, please, one short question and then...
Okay, one short aspect is this interesting word of institution, and this somehow institutional connotations. And you quoted Husserl as the original institutor of institution, and it is Stiftung.
Yeah, Stiftung. I know it's strange.
And it's not a good. The two kind of like close English translations you gave, or one gives, are actually misleading to my view. Establishment of foundation, and Stiftung is more a sort of gifting. So what you can actually do is Leben stiften. So it's a sort of creative gifting. It's very important as an aspect, and I think Husserl, of course, had this in mind, and it shifts the whole thing to something very less formal and very much more somewhat more mysterious even. So I think that's important in terms of even tackling, and I won't do this now, even questioning this the translations or the way we use the word norms now. When this comes back to that, so I think there's discussion needs to be had about this, and that's a little door I'd like to open up.
Thanks for pointing that out. Just a comment. That's exactly the reason why Merleau-Ponty translates Stiftung as an institution, not foundation. Right?
Yeah.
So he is there with you, and you're there.
It's different in French than it is in English, as very often. There's a different connotation in French.
Of course, it's not a translation.
It's like assemblage coming from agencement becoming assemblage, and then it's something very different. But it's important to see what the original creator of the term had as a background for it. It's important to keep with some vibrancy of the idea, I'd say.
We were having a lot of discussion about this, and maybe me so even more than Jan, because Jan was approaching this mostly from the French perspective, but for me, which was given from the English side, this was always a stumbling block, the institution. I will be honest, I dislike the term. So hopefully, maybe we find something that would be, like you suggested, more vibrant. I wouldn't be averse to this possibility.
We would like to explain the things without the notion, but so far we were unable to.
Of course, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe final round of applause for this section.